at the Northern Research Station office there in Minnesota. And while in that position, I was able to engage in a suite of projects, mainly a landscape simulation modeling focus, in which we looked at changing forest and fire conditions in the region. But I was also fortunate to engage in some related modeling projects with colleagues in other research station offices, including Rhinelander, and also folks elsewhere in some of the local universities, and got engaged in a field-based project as well, looking at interactions between logging, wind throw, and fire. And so some of this work, which was just recently published, is mostly what I'm going to highlight today. And with that, I'll move on. So in this presentation, I'd like to start off by just briefly discussing disturbance interactions, especially in terms of priority research areas. And I'd like to talk a little bit about why the Border Lakes is a special landscape, both in terms of its ecological and conservation significance, but also because of its myriad opportunities for research, especially disturbance-based research within a fairly complicated forest matrix in a fairly dynamic landscape. Thirdly, I'll touch on some of the research I was engaged in specifically, and then sprinkle in some examples of other research as well. I'll very briefly highlight some issues regarding future disturbance interactions under climate change and areas for future research. And then a final slide on some thoughts about why this type of research is relevant to both management and restoration objectives. So disturbance interactions, of course, are ubiquitous in forest ecosystems and can result in complex dynamics that affect successional trajectories, forest landscape patterns, and ecological processes at multiple spatial and temporal scales. And these interactions may occur among various forest disturbance agents, including insect and disease outbreaks, wind throw, timber harvest, fire, as well as being influenced by climate and environmental gradients. And basically, there are, of course, different ways to address these types of dynamics through field-based research, simulation models, theoretical models, and so on. But some of the priority areas for research, at least according to Sherrick et al. Article, include investigating past disturbance effects on future disturbance intensities and severities, determining how spatial legacies created by past disturbance events influence the spatial patterns, frequency, and synchrony of future disturbance events, understanding synergistic interactions among disturbance agents that can dramatically alter forest composition, structure, and function, and increase our focus on large landscapes and long time periods, and increasingly examining the role of climate change. And this last point is really made possible due in part to technological and conceptual advances in forest landscape simulation models. And I'm going to try to give some examples of these points throughout my presentation. So on to the Border Lakes region. I focus on this region not just because of my research interest or that some of these questions couldn't be addressed elsewhere, but the first reason I focus on it is that sort of a practical one. This is where much of my research over the last few years took place. But also, I have had an opportunity to study in a diverse array of ecosystems ranging from sagebrush to ponderosa pine out west to the forest of Minnesota and Ontario under my postdoc. And I really do think the Border Lakes region offers unmatched opportunities in terms of examining the complexities of disturbance interactions at regional scales. And I'll try to highlight that in the next couple of slides. So first thing to know is the Border Lakes region is somewhat unique in part because it's a relatively intact natural landscape that straddles the border between Minnesota and Northwest Ontario. And so it's an international landscape, and that introduces its own set of complexities in terms of management issues in a natural landscape that's bisected by an international border. The map here defines the Border Lakes region based on a project that I was involved in as a postdoc, the Border Lakes Project, and this was the research project I was responsible for while there in the Northern Research Station. But of course, these boundaries or this region could be defined slightly differently depending on various conservation management or research priorities. The region that we studied here for my postdoc work, as it was defined here, is roughly 2.1 million hectares. So it's a very large landscape. And as you may have gathered from the last slide, most of the land area is forested. In fact, of the land area, over 95% of the region is forested. But roughly 20% is comprised of freshwater lakes, as well as myriad wetlands, lakes and streams that cover the landscape. And in terms of forest composition, it lies along a transition zone between northern temperate forest types and southern boreal types. And as such, it contains special species typical of both those types, including what you might expect: the jack pine, black spruce, white spruce, balsam fir, red pine, white pine, etc., and a few deciduous species as well, but in particular paper birch and aspen. Historically, this is a region that was comprised of fire-dependent forest ecosystems. This single slide is really an oversimplification, but there are at least two main types of forest fire types that were prevalent in shaping this forest landscape. High severity crown fires dominated much of the landscape and supported forests of jack pine and often earlier successional compositions dominated by aspen and birch. And mean fire rotations probably were on the order of 50 to 100 plus years. And some areas that escaped fire for longer periods were more likely to be dominated by spruce and fir and other forest types. But it also had a fairly substantial, although a smaller area, that was comprised of red pine and white pine that were maintained by mostly low and mixed severity fire regimes that may have had mean fire returns or rotations of anywhere from 5 to 100 years. We know a lot of this based on some of the seminal work that Bud Heinzelman did throughout his career using dendrochronology evidence to establish stand age dates and fire rotations. But we also know that the area has been affected by other disturbance agents as well, wind throw, as well as insects and disease. Because of its fire history, these systems really are resilient to disturbance, at least fire disturbance, but as well as other natural disturbance agents. And of course, there's much concern among some about recent fires. These pictures show examples of various goings-ons and results of the fire that occurred in 2007 and 2006, the Ham Lake and Cavity Lake fires. We do know that these systems are able to recover from fire fairly quickly. We can see pictures that show various examples or stages of succession and recovery from use of wildlife right after the fire to emergent young plants, sort of on the left there. But also, if you look at the pictures on the right, we can see that fire is not always stand replacing, as is apparent in the forest picture in the upper right, with a mixed severity fire and some fairly healthy regeneration. But we also know these systems come back relatively quickly in most cases too, at least historically. The picture in the lower right is a fire from the late 70s, and that picture was taken in, I think, 2008. And so a fairly dense stand of jack pine and other forest species have recolonized that landscape. Historically, the region was subjected to a lot of different influences, of course. Historic and contemporary logging practices, as well as fire exclusion, have changed the landscape. The establishment of conservation areas have also had an effect on the landscape in terms of composition and forest structure. Currently, about 43% of the landscape is within park and wilderness areas. And even though that's true, those areas have changed as well as a result primarily of fire suppression activities. those activities have moved much of that part of the landscape into more late successional or conifer-dominated forests, at least until fairly recent years, until a suite of fairly large disturbance events that I'll talk about in just a little bit. While outside of park and wilderness areas, logging activity and often short rotation logging activities have increased early successional forest, often dominated by aspen, and have often created a more patchy forest mosaic. So as a result of these influences, we've really ended up with sort of a bifurcated landscape where we have protected areas that are more late successional, surrounded by more timber managed areas that tend to be early successional. And this has resulted in a mix of patterns on the landscape, often creating distinctly separate landscape structures. As you can imagine, in the upper left, you can see the result of a fire and its effect on patch structure and ultimately on forest composition. In the lower left, industrial forest landscape. And this can often define landscape boundaries as well in the Border Lakes region. If you look at the pictures to the right, the aerial photos, you can see how logging activity outside of Voyageurs National Park and Quetico Provincial Park are really apparent, and you can essentially define the boundaries of those parks from these aerial images. And often these things aren't as neat as just being contained within a particular border. In the Quetico picture, for instance, a large wildfire that burned in the 90s burned over the border into surrounding crown lands and created a additional disturbance interaction between the timber harvest activities going on outside of the park and then the more recent fire impacts that followed. And this complex relationship is probably pretty apparent with this slide that shows that most of the landscape is publicly owned. In fact, about 95% of the Border Lakes region is publicly owned. But it's a complicated mix, not only of land ownership, but also the various management emphases. And as such, it has resulted in complex patterns of forest composition. You know, in addition to this great bifurcation between park and wilderness areas and the surrounding lands that have been developing over the last several decades, we also have these more complex patterns going on as well. This is also, you know, we could think of the bifurcation at a larger scale as well, as more or less a situation where we have an isolated island of unlogged forest habitat inside an otherwise highly fragmented southern boreal forest biome. You can see from this map that industrial scale logging activities throughout the middle and southern boreal forests have left landscapes like the Border Lakes region fairly isolated, but also fairly valuable for a lot of conservation purposes. So given that sort of natural and human history, in recent years, we've witnessed some fairly large disturbance effects that have further changed this landscape. In 1999, there was a large blowdown event or a derecho event that affected over roughly 200,000 hectares within the Border Lakes region and caused extensive overstory mortality across most of its path. There have been at least 3 large fires that have burned in the last 6 years or so that collectively have burned over 80,000 hectares. And one question is whether or not these types of disturbances are pushing the landscape outside of its historical range of variability. And to some extent, probably not. Certainly, this is a landscape that burned many times in the past, as we know from the work of Bud Heinzelman and others. The map at right shows the historical fire perimeters compared to and some dates, and I apologize, that map's not very good quality, but you can see the pattern of past fires, and then superimposed on top of that are the boundaries of the 2006 and 2007 fires, which were quite large, tens of thousands of hectares. And you can see that those fires don't really stand out in terms of size on this landscape, and you can see too that the landscape is burned frequently. Oops. But there is a question of whether or not there are interactions with climate change and land use and non-native species and so on. Are we seeing larger or longer fire seasons and more severe fire? Are these ecosystems recovering as they naturally would after fire? Those are important questions, and of course there is some research going on trying to address those questions, and I think it's very important because as we see these large disturbance events and wonder about the recovery, we have to think about whether or not we're on the sort of historical trajectory that we would expect in terms of succession, or if we're on some new trajectory. And even the events themselves may be in question, again, in terms of severity or their extent. The large wind throw event in particular was really fairly unprecedented in this landscape. This is research that was a part of a partnership effort between the Northern Research Station and the Nature Conservancy and others. And the idea was to address certain concerns and issues for the Border Lakes region in terms of sustainable forest resources, interest in restoring forest composition and conserving biodiversity, and reducing fire risk where possible, and determining if these types of objectives are compatible. And the goal is to use modeling to explore alternative management scenarios and ultimately develop a quantitative, spatially explicit vision for the landscape and identify collaborative opportunities for agencies to achieve these mutually desired conditions. And the mutually desired refers to the fact that there are a lot of the major land agencies that are interested in moving the landscape back toward a more historic range of conditions, maybe not achieving those conditions, but moving toward those conditions under the assumption that that would be a more sustainable forest landscape condition over the long term. So I used LANDIS-II. I won't go into a lot of detail about this. Many on the phone probably know about LANDIS, but it's a spatially explicit stochastic forest landscape simulation model that simulates various processes, including succession, disturbance, species establishment, and dispersal in their interactions. And it projects various response variables of interest over time, steps defined by the user, and spatially, both at a sort of a raster cell level as well as user-defined ecoregions, including attributes like species age cohorts and their distributions, biomass, disturbance events, and so on. And it allows us then to compare the effects of different model scenarios based on, say, the effects of different management alternatives or different disturbance regimes or different climate change scenarios that we're interested in examining. And our research questions were really, how might fire and timber harvest influence future forest conditions? Can timber harvest and fire be used to restore forest ecosystems and meet these commonly held desired future conditions? How might management actions influence future fire risk? And again, we use LANDIS to do this by simulating various wind throw, fire, and timber harvest scenarios that varied not only by the ownership within each scenario, but also varied among alternative scenarios so that we could get at some possible alternative futures for the landscape by testing different assumptions about fire use and timber harvest. And so here's some output from that work. This is forest composition among the scenarios, showing the 6 scenarios compared to the model year 0, which is essentially the current forest landscape shown at bottom right. The natural disturbance scenario represents essentially no logging and a historical fire regime. In other words, high severity fires that would have created large patches of jack pine and aspen and some older pockets of spruce and fir, as well as low severity fires that supported fire tolerant old red pine and white pine. The current natural disturbance scenario on the upper right essentially is a scenario that represents fire suppression effects, so very little to no fire allowed outside of park and wilderness areas, and only limited wildfire use within the wilderness areas in wind throw, but no timber harvest. The current management scenario is essentially the same as the current natural disturbance scenario, but adding in timber harvest based on contemporary management plans among major landowners. And then the restoration management scenarios represent different combinations of restoration forestry techniques, as well as the use of more wildfire within park and wilderness areas, such that it approaches the sort of natural fire rotation that would have occurred during pre-settlement periods. And here at year 50, now so 50 years into the future, we can already see a dramatic transformation in the landscape composition as the current management scenario and the current natural disturbance scenario move more toward a late successional forest, especially in the park and wilderness areas in the current management scenario, while by comparison, the natural disturbance scenario and the restoration management scenarios are fairly different, but you can see in the natural disturbance scenario, for instance, a lot more jack pine reappearing on the landscape as a result of fire. At year 100, those trends continue. You can see that the current management scenario is looking increasingly bifurcated in the sense that much more late successional forests in the park and wilderness areas and much younger forests or aspen-dominated forests outside of those areas. And by year 200, those trends kind of continue, but now some changes are occurring as a result of the buildup of those later successional and more fire-prone forests. We do see the effect of fire now within the current management scenario with some of those large white patches, for instance, our recent fires. But if you look at, for instance, the natural disturbance scenario or the restoration management scenarios, you see more even patterns of forest types on the landscape, as well as probably a better distribution of the forest cover types that we would hope for under a restoration objective. In terms of the bifurcation, we actually measured that. We came up with a metric to measure that essentially shows a quantified deviation from an even proportional distribution of major forest types between park and wilderness areas and the rest of the more timber managed landscape. And what you can see is that the current management scenario produced the most bifurcated landscape over time, and the natural disturbance scenario by far the least. And the restoration management scenarios, again, using combinations of more wildfire in protected areas and timber harvest outside of protected areas, were sort of in between. So achieving some of those restoration goals. In terms of other measures, we looked at things like the metrics of landscape forest pattern, as well as age class distributions. Here we're looking at age class distributions. And you can see that if a goal is to return some of the landscape to a sort of a negative exponential distribution of age classes, which would be expected for boreal forests with the standard replacing fire regime, and we just kind of look at the top graph, which is the entire Border Lakes region, again, we can see different results where we achieve that goal to some extent in the natural disturbance and restoration management scenarios, with more in the younger age classes sloping off sharply to the older age classes. We don't quite achieve that in the current management scenario, and in the current natural disturbance scenario, we really don't at all. We have a much more even distribution of forest age classes. So again, representing how these different restoration objectives possibly can be achieved using wildfire and timber harvest. We also were interested then in just looking at what these objectives might be collectively. So here's a graph that shows, I'm just going to go ahead and turn on these other colors, but the current management scenario really didn't meet any of our objectives except for reducing aspen dominance to some extent. That was only after quite some time in the model, whereas the natural disturbance scenario and the restoration management scenarios did do things like increase jack pine, decrease aspen dominance on much of the landscape, created patch size distributions that were more reflective of the historical period, achieved some age class distribution objectives, and reduced the bifurcation on the landscape that I referred to earlier. So on those, based on those criteria, those were fairly successful scenarios. But there were some misses as well across the board. We were never really able to restore red and white pine on the landscape, primarily because it was not regenerating in these generally later, older forests over time, and then being wiped out by large fires that we were simulating on the landscape. So clearly some forest types are going to require a lot more effort. We also looked at fire risk over time, and we averaged this over a 200-year model period, which essentially reflected a composite value for the fire risk, reflected a composite value of the forest type and age, the effect of wind throw events, and the number of periods with fire activity, and that was calculated for each cell. And the key thing here is that you can just see at the map at right that the patterns really vary, with again sort of a bifurcated pattern again in the current management scenario, much more fire-prone forests within park and wilderness areas, but because of harvest outside of those areas, less fire prone. And you can see in the natural disturbance scenario, although we achieved a lot of our compositional and structural goals, much more of the area is basically at risk to has much higher fire risk as a result of successfully restoring more fire-prone jack pine forests. So, there are trade-offs involved here. The graph at left just sort of shows that same pattern statistically. If you look at the bottom right, or the bottom graph, that further shows the influence of implementing a prescribed fire zone around park and wilderness areas to see if we could prevent the spread and the severity of fires onto surrounding more developed landscapes. And by and large, using prescribed fire in the model didn't really achieve a whole lot, although there was some statistically significant reduction in one of the scenarios, at least in the outer part of this prescribed fire buffer zone, where timber harvest was also used. So the combination of some restoration and forestry techniques along with prescribed fire did slightly reduce the mean fire risk. So kind of not particularly successful there, but some potential. Now I'm going to shift gears a bit and talk about a project that I was fortunate to be involved with, another modeling project with Brian Sturdivant, Brian Miranda, and others, looking at spruce budworm and fire. And this also was a modeling project using LANDIS, where we looked at eastern spruce budworm, a species that can have major outbreaks in this region, generally every few decades historically. And the conventional wisdom is such that it's that the more spruce budworm we have, the more fire, because it enhances fire incidents usually several years following a defoliation event because of the increase in dead ladder fuels. Its primary host is balsam fir, secondarily white spruce, and as it sweeps through an area, there is a lot of standing dead fuel that can potentially increase fire risk, at least over the short term. And I'm really going to kind of breeze through the results here and hopefully do it some justice. But we compared 4 scenarios. We looked at a contemporary scenario with essentially, this was just within I should point out, this is just within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness where these results were reported from. But the contemporary scenario looked at a fire suppression regime that resulted in about 400-year rotation. A pre-settlement scenario that looked at or used a 120-year fire rotation. And then we would include a spruce budworm scenario in combination with each of those fire regime scenarios. And the spruce budworm outbreaks were calibrated to occur about every 33 years on average. So we have a contemporary fire only, contemporary fire and budworm, a pre-settlement fire, and a pre-settlement fire and budworm. And basically, the graph at left shows that the mean severity, fire severity and fire return intervals averaged over a 300-year model period differed primarily depending on whether it was the modern or pre-settlement fire rotation that was simulated. But you can see that, at least in the case of the contemporary fire regime, spruce budworm did result in noticeably longer fire rotations. And that's primarily because the contemporary scenario trended toward more of a mixture of deciduous species and shade-tolerant conifers, with disturbances being dominated by a combination of budworm defoliation and high-severity fires, whereas the pre-settlement scenario retained a more landscape more dominated by red pine and white pine and tamarack to some extent. It experienced less budworm disturbance overall, and ultimately ended up with lower severity fire regimes, mostly because the primary host species, fir, couldn't increase as it did in the contemporary scenario. And so the graph at right that really kind of shows that. It shows these changing percentages of the landscape for each of the various major forest types, and they're defined by their host value, with the primary host values being higher up on each bar. And you can see the differences in patterns between these different fire and budworm scenarios. So effectively, budworm increased the area burned during outbreaks on a short-term level, but over the long term, it actually decreased the overall area burned and often decreased severity as the interactions with fire resulted in much less balsam fir on the landscape. So just to quickly summarize the Border Lakes region in terms of some of the restoration objectives that we were hoping to get at with modeling. what we did discover is that the continuation of a current management scenario was not likely to move forests closer toward their historic range of variability. In contrast, um, the restoration and natural disturbance scenarios were fairly successful at moving the landscape toward these historical range of variability benchmarks. And in doing so, we're able to reduce forest bifurcation. It returned some of the landscape to a natural composition, natural age class distributions, and so on, relative to the current management scenario. There were issues, of course, like I mentioned earlier. We had difficulties retaining red and white pine. In terms of its total area on the landscape, it reduced in all scenarios. And there are issues in terms of optimization between achieving fire risk goals and restoration objectives. So if we want to restore jack pine on the landscape, we're likely to see more fire, as we saw in the natural disturbance scenarios and in some of the restoration management scenarios. More fire suppression, however, also resulted in more fire, especially in parks and wilderness areas, as we saw in the current management scenario. When we were able to increase aspen on the landscape, we did get less fire, at least on those portions of the landscape, and that suggests that there may be ways to optimize the forest restoration and fire use activities to consider spatially strategic ways to limit the spread of fire, but also achieve some restoration goals. And lastly, by doing the research with Brian Sturtevant and others, we can also see that we have to consider other disturbance interactions as well, including insect-fire interactions that also are going to be important considerations for restoration and fire risk objectives over the long term. Okay, going to switch gears one more time here and talk about a field-based project with Sean Fravor and John Bradford and Brian Pollock and others looking at interactions between salvage logging, blowdown, and fire. And this came about because of a fairly rare sequence of events in the sense that we had three disturbance interactions, or three disturbance types that interacted in a way that we could study them and look at the effects quite effectively. We had a blowdown event that occurred in 1999, as I mentioned earlier, that was followed by salvage logging activity designed to reduce fuel loads. But then in May of 2007, so after the blowdown and after the salvage logging, we did have the large fire that blew through that burned through the region and burned most of the plots that had been salvage logged and suffered from blowdown. So we had an opportunity to look at the interactions between all of these disturbance events, the 1999 blowdown, as well as the following effects. So what we were able to do is look at least three of those interactions in some of these events, just singularly, fire only, blowdown and fire, and then blowdown, salvage logging and fire. We used a method in the field to measure fire severity effects, a method developed by Teresa Jane and Graham that looked at severity effects measured both at the tree crown level, but also the forest floor level. And what we found is that salvage logging only slightly decreased crown severity. You can see in the graph at right, the letters represent categorical definitions of fire severity among our plots based on the method developed by Jane and Graham, with the least severe fire severity values to the left and the most severe to the right. And then the number of plots that are within each of our treatment combinations indicated by the black, the gray, and the white. And what you can hopefully tell is that salvage logging only slightly decreased crown severity overall. It did, however, though, significantly increase the forest floor and soil burn severity in our plots. And although not necessarily a measure of fire severity, it also decreased the abundance of the structural legacies that would have been a remnant of blowdown or fire, including down woody debris and snags. And it overall increased the sort of the homogeneity of the community composition post-fire as well. So those were sort of the effects. And basically, we hypothesized that the influence on the soil severity was most likely due to the logging activities that probably um, would have removed a lot of the duff and exposed a lot of the mineral soils, or a lot of the soils, to greater burning by lingering fires, and resulted in much more of an impact on the floor conditions and the soil conditions relative to those sites that were not salvage logged. In a companion study, we also looked at the influence of these interactions on carbon pools, and what we found was that individually blowdown or fire caused similar decreases in live carbon and total ecosystem carbon. The blowdown increased carbon and down woody material in forest floors, you might expect, whereas fires retain more carbon in standing snags. Fire after blowdown also caused a substantial additional reduction in ecosystem carbon stock. So compared to just the blowdown alone, fire removed a lot of carbon from the system. And salvage logging further decreased carbon stored in snags and down woody material, but compared to just blowdown and fire, it was not significantly different. So here we have a case where, depending on your objectives and the importance of these various carbon pools and the structural legacies that they represent, the effects of salvage logging may or may not be desirable depending on management objectives. So lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some future disturbance interactions under climate change. We can expect that in the future, fire will remain a critical driver of the Border Lakes region ecosystems, and based on our research, we might expect it to increase in the future, or based on others' research, we could expect it to increase in the future, especially if we see not only warmer but drier conditions, as have been projected under some global climate change models. For instance, Flanagan et al. Estimated a nearly twofold increase in the annual area burned in the boreal forest by the end of the next century. And you can see the sort of patterns of that increase in his research there at right, and underneath that is a graph showing that we're seeing much larger fires on average over the course of the last couple of decades. Not necessarily more fires, but larger fires. And so besides thinking about the further interaction of climate change on species distributions alone by looking at bioclimatic envelopes or shifting ecological niches, future forests are going to likely depend significantly on interactions between these climate-driven altered fire regimes, as well as species dispersal abilities and competitive dynamics, the influx of non-native species, and then interactions with other disturbance agents. So these are going to continue to be important dynamics into the future. And of course, depending on the type of research or the changes that are of interest, we might come up with different predictions depending on our study focus, the methods used, and so on. So for instance, Freilich and Reich speculated that shift in moisture availability, increasingly frequent and large disturbance events, such as fire and wind throw, and warming temperatures could potentially transform much of the Border Lakes region to from a forest-dominated landscape to more of a savanna woodland type landscape. But somewhat in contrast, again using a LANDIS-II model, Ravenscroft et al. Looked at some adjacent areas in northeastern Minnesota and projected a climate-induced shift away from boreal forest species toward less fire-prone temperate forests dominated by maple. Depending on additional scenarios that they looked at, they were able to retain some conifer components on the landscape, red pine and white pine, for instance, but in general, most scenarios would move more toward a maple dominated future. So clearly, how we look at the future depends in part on the type of research that we're going to engage in and the key questions that we're interested in, but we can get somewhat different stories depending on our focus and the methods that we use. In my own research, I have an ongoing modeling project in the Border Lakes region where I'm examining the climatic influences on fire weather conditions and species establishment probabilities in the Border Lakes region. And I don't have much to show in terms of results right now. But it's clear that we're getting a hotter future. The question is whether it's going to be wetter or drier, or what those patterns of precipitation are going to look like in the future. The graph at left just kind of shows, as you would expect, based on most climate change models, under a higher emission scenario, we can expect both high and low temperatures, and this is calculated for the Border Lakes region, to be on average about 6 degrees Celsius or 5 to 6 degrees Celsius warmer in the future. But some of the questions are that are relevant to modeling and projecting future landscapes in terms of the forest composition and the species distributions will include, again, these interactions between species movement and fire, and some of the key climate drivers that will influence that, especially the fire component, are going to be things like whether the amount of snowpack that we have on the landscape in terms of the duration of the snow and the arrival of snowmelt versus the earlier snowmelt dates that are expected versus a later arrival of snow during the beginning of the winter season. Those could extend our fire seasons and potentially make for much longer lasting fires that could shorten fire rotations. And one of the ways to look at this is to use a relatively new extension for the LANDIS-II model. It's a dynamic fire and fuels extension that allows for interactions between dynamic fire weather conditions and fuel types. This was a model that was developed by Disturbance et al. In 2009. And so that's one of the tools I'm planning on using in my research to address some of these questions. And I guess I'd like to just conclude with a few final thoughts then about not only the importance of disturbance interactions to restoration and to management of landscapes like the Border Lakes region, but also the role of restoration itself, and in particular, whether or not the concept of historical range of variability is still even relevant to management of regions like the Border Lakes. And I think there's arguments that have been made on both sides. One is that trying to restore or use the historical range of variability as a target for restoration or for management is really no longer relevant, that the future conditions just won't be anywhere near those that we've experienced in the past, and that under climate change, a better emphasis would be to aim for adaptive management strategies in the face of an uncertain future, where we're focusing more on promoting resiliency or resistance or responsive ecosystems in directions that are likely to be more sustainable. But we can also look at it from the other perspective as well. There's arguments that still, I think, are persuasive for using the historical range of variability as a guide for management. The first, in my mind, is that the more degraded an ecosystem is currently, the more removed it is from its historic range of variability, the more likely that we're going to have ecosystems that are going to be vulnerable to ecological change and more likely to pass some ecological threshold that would be undesirable. And so some have suggested that a better way to think about it is to look at both past conditions, or the historical range of variability conditions, as well as projecting future range of variability conditions and learning from both. Look at what we know from past conditions, estimate what we can about future conditions, and then make our management decisions based on that. And clearly the effects of changing drivers, climate change, land use, and so on are going to be critical to future disturbance interactions, but it's true that these are going to be highly uncertain. And so I think that it does require us to think about how we're going to sustain these landscapes and in terms of their biodiversity and the goods and services that they provide us. And as far as researchers, I think there's a lot of ways that we can investigate this, continuing to use historical ecology techniques, monitoring conditions on the landscape, using modeling, as I have in some of my research, as well as, of course, good basic empirical data through observational or experimental research that can address a lot of these questions, and then compiling that information and continuing to be adaptive in terms of our approach as we see how future conditions actually are changing the landscape and probably currently already are. So I see a role of all of these approaches being critical, but that disturbance interactions are going to be a key component of management of landscapes like the Border Lakes region in the future. And that's pretty much all I have. I just wanted to say that a lot of the research that I presented was funded from a variety of sources, including the National Fire Plan, the Joint Fire Science Program, Nature Conservancy, the Northern Research Station, as well as others, Minnesota Forest Resource Council, and others. So with that, I'll close and take any questions.
Well, thanks, Doug. Appreciate it. So just as a reminder, if you do have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box there. While we're waiting to see if anybody has any, I'll ask a couple. So for your the Boundary Lakes region you're working in that study landscape, can you discuss or let us know how the benchmark targets were established that you were using in your modeling?
Sure.
Sure. Those were based primarily on a review of the literature. So we had information about the roughly what the forest composition was from Heinzelman's work, as well as some of the patch size distributions. Let's see, what else do we have in there? We had the, the bifurcation, I think, is just sort of an obvious objective, because clearly the landscape didn't have that sort of structural condition prior to these management and ownership patterns that were superimposed upon this natural landscape. So the goal there was just to compare this bifurcated landscape to what would hopefully be a more neutrally distributed patch distribution, at least at the large landscape scale. There's been a fair amount of research as well that has documented the increase historically of species like aspen on parts of the landscape. Some of the work of University of Minnesota, Lee Freilich and Peter Reich and others have looked at how aspen has increased historically, and ponderosa pine, or excuse me, white pine and red pine have decreased on much of the landscape. So a lot of it was just derived from the literature.
Okay. And then what about some more specifics on the practices associated with the salvage logging in that experiment? Were there any legacies of the fire that were left, such as snags or some coarse woody debris, or was a lot of it removed?
Yeah, after the fire came through with the blowdown effect, there were snags that were left behind. I don't know if I showed any results about those structural legacies. That was a part of the research project that I wasn't directly involved in, but I think the primary differences were, the reduction in the down woody debris and the standing snags. Those sort of structural legacies were removed increasingly with each additional disturbance. So as we went from blowdown to fire, and then blowdown, fire, and salvage, we would essentially lose those structural components on the landscape, or you'd see a reduction in those structural components within a stand or a site, if that's what you're getting at. Are you still there, Charles?
Can you hear me, Doug?
Yeah. Did you hear any of that?
I did. Yep.
Yeah.
Did I guess where I was thinking too is whether any of that material would have affected the fire severity, both of some of your modeling into the future. And it sounds like it would have.
Oh, right.
Oh, right. Oh, I see.
Yeah, I think it could.
Yeah, I think it could.
It's not represented in
It's
my
not
model.
represented in my model of restoration. With new changes to LANDIS, though, I think there are opportunities to do that. I'm going to probably mischaracterize this a little bit, but with the new biomass extension that's been developed for LANDIS, which tracks the biomass conditions both in the live and dead pools, as well as the new fuels extension that's been developed, I think there are ways to get at that, but there are still limitations within LANDIS. There's probably others in the presentation that know this much better than I do, but I think there are ways to get at that with LANDIS, to look at those structural legacies and look at their influence on future fire conditions. But it's a little more specific than I've been able to, than I've applied LANDIS in the past, and I think it's probably beyond its capabilities right now, although there's some potential to do that with some of the additional extensions that have been developed. So again, I'm probably not doing a very good job of answering that. Those folks that have used some of these other extensions more than I have
Okay,
will
great.
give you a better answer.
Any other questions out there today? Hopefully everybody was able to get back on. If you are on, I apologize for the technical issues. I think while we were going through the part where I lost audio earlier, I was trying to explain that we're using a new version of Adobe Connect that the university doesn't necessarily have it all set up. They've moved from a pilot license to a more permanent license, and they don't have everything together. So we'll hopefully it will be set to go next week. Usually we use a phone bridge that makes the audio much more clear. So one thing, Doug, is that question that I would have is, you did say that there was poor conditions for red and white pine, but I did notice that on your maps earlier for the entire region, there were some pockets, especially in the southeast corner, where there seemed to be a perpetuation of a red and white pine forest. I don't know if you've noticed that, and if you have any ideas as to what the interaction was there that allowed that system to be maintained.
Yeah, sure. We did do that deliberately
Yeah,
in the
sure.
model.
We did do that deliberately in the model. We actually designed or designated
fire zones,
low severity fire
as well
zones,
as some restoration,
as well as some restoration timber harvest techniques that would reduce more late successional species within those stands, and improve the opportunities for red and white pine to regenerate. So between the prescribed fire zones and the restoration fire activities that were distributed in certain management areas within the landscape, we did retain red and white pine in some of the models all the way through. Where we tended to lose it was where we had either no timber management that would allow those stands to open up and produce opportunities to regenerate, or where we had large fires that essentially wiped out remnant red and white pine stands.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. So these were set up as sort of, right. They were sort of maintenance fires then.
Right. Yeah. Conditions that would be conducive to continued regeneration of red and white pine. And so one way to think of that too is that it required quite a bit of the landscape, even though it wasn't a large proportion of the landscape in terms of total area. It would have required quite a bit of fairly intensive restoration forestry or prescribed fire that most likely would be fairly expensive, especially in more remote wilderness areas. So even that might have been a somewhat unrealistic expectation in terms of the realities of funds and management on the landscape. But in the model, of course, it's easier to turn those things on in the model and designate them. But in the real world, it would require some costly restoration.
Sure. We've got another question here. Could you describe the management under the restoration scenarios that you modeled compared to the current management model?
Sure.
We did a few different things. The first was to allow for a shorter fire rotation within park and wilderness areas. So within Quetico and the boundary waters, we parameterized the model to have a fairly short rotation of around 100 years or so for much of the landscape, and then with stand replacing fires, which would help to regenerate jack pine and those types of species, earlier successional species, but then also designated some areas where low severity fire maintained red and white pine, as I was mentioning earlier. And then outside of parks and wilderness, we looked at using larger clear cuts, especially on the Canadian side, where they generally are allowed to use much larger clear cuts than we can on the US side of the border. And those clear cuts were designed to not increase the rate of cutting, but rather just concentrate logging activity in these larger cuts to emulate natural disturbance patterns, large fire patterns, for instance. So we had more types of logging in some parts of the landscape that would emulate large natural disturbance patterns, and then in other areas where we targeted certain species like red pine and white pine, we also used harvest techniques that would remove some of the late successional species like spruce and fir, and again attempt to perpetuate red and white pine stands by keeping those stands fairly open and improving conditions for red and white pine establishment and then recruitment. Those are just a couple of examples, but those are the kind of things we did in terms of the forest restoration techniques that we used.
Sounds pretty interesting. So were any of those related to what we would consider sort of a variable retention harvest, opening the canopy up 60 to 70%, or?
Yeah, I mean, more specifically, we could use like a shelterwood.
Yeah, I mean, more specifically, we could use like a shelterwood approach, for instance. We could thin. The harvest extension in Landis is actually fairly flexible, so you can design a lot of species and age-specific removal targets within a stand. Ideally, then to promote the advancement or maintenance of a particular forest type of interest. So there's quite a few ways that you can achieve that in Landis by being very specific about the frequency of the harvest, the size of the harvest, and the species and age cohorts that are targeted.
Okay, great. Any more questions out there before we wrap things up here today? Looks like folks are starting to sign off here, Doug. I think I'll wrap things up here then. I'd like to thank Doug again and everybody online for joining us this afternoon for a very interesting webinar and discussion. If you'd like to review the webinar or share with somebody that might be interested, we will have a recording of the webinar up. We'll have to try to figure out how to splice the two together, though, because of the technical issues that we had here. And then finally, just a reminder that on February 21st, we have our next webinar as part of our consortia webinar series, and that will be in sort of the same region and is titled Fire Effects from the Pagami Creek Fire, and that will be presented by Brian Sturdivant of the U.S. Forest Service. So wait online here for any other questions for another couple of seconds, but thank you very much, Doug. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, I think we'll end the webinar today. Thanks again.